Scots Vyce Squad, giving voice to Scotland's character and characters. This episode gives voice to James MacDonald Reid, piper and folklorist from the Scots Gaelic Tradition. Here he discusses the importance of our culture, its parallels across Europe, its authenticity, the dangers of fragmentation, fakelore, ham actors making squeaky noises while mispronouncing place names, and other challenges to its survival as a genuine inheritance.
A facet of dance. Traditional Scottish music should be a facet of music. They should be all part of a single culture because they lose their meaning once you separate them.
Yes, there's meanings to the dance. There's meanings behind phrases of pipe tunes. There's instances when people have communicated more than just music, and you'd only know that, I believe, if you know the whole of the tradition.
Absolutely, because in a traditional society, you're brought up, for example, with folk tales. You hear them time and time again. You know who the characters are in the folk tales, and therefore, if somebody has a song and mentions one of these, or a pipe tune in a title, you know that it's related to that. Outsiders don't. And unfortunately, even the bodies we have now, who are officially the specialists, the main authorities on things like piping and dance and so on, they only know that aspect. They don't understand the others, and so they don't realise these interconnections. They don't have that concept, and it's become so fragmented that its meaning has become lost.
I would say that the traditional media, what we now call the legacy media, have done a less than competent job of establishing in our society an understanding of the foundation of culture that underpins Scotland. Do you think that greater knowledge of our culture would help modern Scotland?
Absolutely. And another thing, of course, is that when I was younger, I'm going back to the 60s, I spent a lot of time in Europe, in villages where they still had a living folk culture. Serbia, Bulgaria, later on Italy and France, Slovakia, Croatia, and then later on Belarus even, and Georgia. And I found parallels. But the parallels only existed when there was a complete holistic culture operating within a single matrix. And they were so obvious to me, but to somebody who only knew one aspect of it, for example, piping or traditional singing or traditional dance, wouldn't catch that.
What would be an example of that? What kind of thing did you recognise in, say, Eastern European culture that you thought, oh, this is cognate with Scottish culture?
A really fine example, I would think, is the need fire, which I'd heard of in Scotland, the lighting of the need fire. And I had very close friends back then. We're going back 50 plus years. Hamish Henderson, David Clement, John McInnes. They had heard of this and they had lectured about it, but they'd never actually seen it. And I said, but I've seen that. I've been present in it. Oh, and they were astonished. Where was that? And I said, Serbia. They did exactly the same thing. And because I had that experience of these, I found an aspect of it that had been forgotten here. And when people have tried to revive these cultural aspects, such as the lighting of the need fire, a particular aspect has been neglected. They didn't know that it was part of it, and that is humour. So when you would go to the lighting of the need fire, I've seen people try to replicate it, and everyone is looking as if they're in a one of these Italian biblical films, and everyone's very close-faced and like this. In actual practice, there's a lot of smiling and joking going on because it's an occasion. It's a pleasant time you're having together, and the children participate. That's very important. I notice here they do the Beltane every year, and it's exclusively a particular age group. They exclude children, old people and disabled people. No traditional community would do that.
No. And it's about community, isn't it?
It is. It's totally community focused. It's not about the individual showing off. It's not look at me, look at me, look at me. But that's what it's become here. Because even when it comes to places like the Storytelling Centre, you can tell right off the bat that people get into it, largely ham actors, who use as their role models stand-up comics. They are not familiar with the traditional method of delivering a folk tale. And the traditional method, which I stick to quite rigidly, you don't do gags for laughs. They're usually built in there, but the main function is to deliver the tale and deliver in a way that it's easy to follow. And that means you give the bare skeleton of it. You direct the people, you put in the repetitions, or you keep the repetitions in there, and you don't fill in too many colours. It's like you do a black and white and let them fill in the colours, but give them time to do that. Because when you're listening to a tale that goes on for more than an hour, and I often tell tales that are more than an hour, your mind will wander. You'll hear things in the tale that will remind you of something that you've experienced or something from another tale. And so you have to give them the opportunity to relax and bring those in their own minds, and not have to focus really, really tightly on following the narrative.
So you're reminding people of where we've got to with the story and giving
Yes.
them another chance to come back in.
Well, yes.
This
So they
is-
can drift out any time, but they can join in again. So I notice it even when collecting the Grimm's Brothers tales. The publishers are still pretty good about keeping in the repetition. So something would happen 3 times. You would use exactly the same terms, same words and expressions each time it happened. And Gaels always did that as well, and Lowland Scots as well. But you're running it through, and the listeners might think, do I have enough eggs in the the cupboard, or am I going to get my last bus, or something like that?
Yeah.
You have to allow for that, and that's all built into it. It's part of the whole technique. But it's the same with just about every aspect of folk culture that I deal with. It has all of these conventions that have developed over hundreds of years. And I notice them also when I go to places like Bulgaria, Belarus, Slovakia, Abruzzi, and so on, that they have conventions which are built in and which help to include the entire community. It's not about one person showing off.
No, that's important, isn't it? It's not self-indulgent flourishes.
Quite. And arguments, I used to get into heated arguments. Well, it was never literally an argument. There was no temper lost, but just discussions and disagreements with the arts establishment in Scotland. I mean, for a start, for over 40 years, virtually everyone in the arts establishment in Scotland came from England. So they would bring up their stereotypes, which largely come from English music hall, and they would insist on enforcing those. But another observation I made was that they didn't understand the difference between culture and fashion. So they were plugging fashion, assuming that it was culture. So every time they came across Scottish cultural aspects, they had to conform to the current English fashion or Anglo-American fashion. That was enforced. It was rigid. You would not be allowed unless you made that. So it was quite insulting. It was almost racist, the fact that you were not allowed to do it the way you learned it in your own family and community. This was absolutely forbidden. So I always went to Europe, where they were quite welcoming, but I couldn't do it here.
So it's a rejection of authenticity.
Total rejection. And they also separate everything. So Scottish traditional dance is now a category of dance.
Yeah.
As a subcategory. And interestingly enough, I noticed that they had, among the subcategories, you had things like Asian dance. So you had the Asian community in Scotland, largely Pakistan, India, and so on. So they would have a special provision for Asian dance in Scotland. And they had one for Spanish even for a while. Things like that, contemporary dance, tap dance and so on like that, and Scottish dance. That was one of the subcategories. And if you were a Scot, you were immediately put into that, but it was quite restricted and limited. They would only have one grant available for somebody under Scottish dance. The main body of it was all English. So I started referring to that as English dance, and of course they were infuriated. And I said, you categorise everything that's not English, but the default position is English.
Absolutely.
In Scotland.
Absolutely. I have a similar beef about literature, where Scottish literature is called Scottish literature, and things like Shakespeare, Thomas Hardy are just literature. And it's similar. It's a similar point that our literature is categorised, but it's not literature. It's Scottish literature.
Theirs is the default position. Same with accents, for example. I applied to be a guide at the Museum of Scotland, which is in walking distance from my home, and I wasn't interviewed, despite the fact that I got references from such luminaries as the head of an entire department at the British Museum in London. They didn't interview me. I went to the job centre and complained. They contacted them and were told they're not looking for guides with Scottish accents, but they never heard me speak. And if they read through my CV, they could see that I'm quite conversant in several Slavic languages and I'm okay in French and Italian. But the fact that I have a Scottish name and address means that I am a subcategory. So I went there, and sure enough, all the guides were English and had English accents and couldn't pronounce Scottish place names. And indeed, they had a lot of shibboleths of English accents, which are not universal, but they imagine them to be. For example, dropping the post-vocalic R, saying Kona instead of corner, or shifting A to an O before an L, so saying Coola instead of collar. But they assume that it's easier for the world to understand their synthetic shibboleths. And Scottish speech, on an SSE level, not dialect, but our
Standard Scottish English.
Yeah, our pronunciation of phonemes is more universal than theirs, which is more synthetic. So,
do you think it is important that Scottish culture gets delivered with a Scottish accent?
Well, I don't know, but I think I point out is that you get a place like the Scottish Storytelling Centre, of which I was one of the founders. I'm probably the only active member from the original 19 in the original directory. And I was one of the few who came from an actual oral tradition where I'd learned the folk tales within a cultural context, because I didn't learn them specifically as stories outside of it. I learned them within an active culture, and I learned largely from piping teachers or just social situations, but no one had idle hands. So I got a magnificent tale from my piping teacher, who was an auto mechanic, and he recited it while repairing a neighbour's tractor engine, and that's where I learned it. That is very typical, but because it's subsidised now, you get a lot of particularly married couples who move up from England, and they feature themselves as full-time professional Scottish storytellers. I'm still squeamish about being called a storyteller. I do not regard it as an occupation, and in my day it was certainly not something you ever expected to be paid for. But to do as a full-time professional means subsidy. You have to be subsidised. And I find quite a lot of them, because they operate largely they know how to network. And married couples associating with management married couples and whatnot. It's quite a long story, but when they deliver tales, very often they're Scottish stories which they've largely got from books or the internet, without finding out that those stories weren't actually from the oral culture, that they were actually devised by American or English writers for children's books. So they're fakelore. Furthermore, they mispronounce the place names in them, not realising that they have an accent. And they will often say, why should I put on a Scottish accent? Well, you don't have to, but you have to take off your English accent when you say Perth. It's not Perth. You have an English accent. You're the one with the accent in Scotland, not me. So stop, marginalising us.
Fakelore.
Yeah, or Stoneway, or Orkney, Oakney. We even get broadcasters who are getting away with that one, but they think that that's normal. It's not. It's not. But the other thing, which I had quite a lengthy discussion with one of the management people over this one a few years ago. I just said, right, I'm going to take this up. You're selling something. That's subsidised, but you're charging people to go and attend it. And you should sell what you're advertising. Traditional Scottish folktale. And if your storyteller doesn't come across plausibly to the listener as a Scottish tale being told by, they don't have to be a Scot, but they have to sound plausibly like one, or at least as if they're in the community to the extent that they know how to pronounce these things. Otherwise, you're not selling them what they paid for.
Yeah.
And I happen to know that many people would go up and complain about that regularly to the box office, but the management people never get out of their offices. It never gets to them, or they come up with excuses. I've got them. I've induced some of them to write them down, their excuses, and they're not plausible. They're recreating stereotypes which were devised by foreigners. I went to several storytelling sessions last summer at the Scottish Storytelling Centre, being delivered by people who are in full-time positions in Scotland, who've moved up from England, and they were replete with Scottish stereotypes which they brought up from England, some of which are actually quite insulting. For example, one told his story, which was a made-up one. It wasn't from the folk culture at all. Involved a lot of Scottish characters, all of them males, all of them named Angus, and all of whom were alcoholics. And it was how funny I can make this about these drunk Scotsmen. That was the gist of it. Another one, who was a full-time professional Scottish storyteller, moved up from England. She filled hers with squeaky noises and funny faces to try to get laughs out of the audience, to keep them going. And the Scotticisms she came up with were all drawn from this very narrow little stereotype. And it also didn't distinguish the fact that we have different cultural variations throughout Scotland. So, for example, I never heard of a haggis until I went to a school where I had an English schoolmaster who called me a haggis basher when I was 13 because I played the pipes. I had to ask my grandmother what haggis was. Even in Gaelic-speaking households in the Northwest Highlands, there was a part of my family came from mid-Argyll. They were familiar with Scots poetry and Scots culture. Lowlanders often knew a lot of Highland tunes, even if they didn't know Gaelic. They would know some Gaelic phrase, they'd know bits of it. They had that familiarity.
And your own piping, you started piping when?
Well, my father taught me the basics of practice chant and all that when I was an infant, in essence. But I started getting pipe tutoring from a proper teacher at the age of 9. And I won a gold medal at 13. So it was nothing since, of course.
But you understand the lore around all the pipe tunes and so on.
Yes.
And this is an important part of it.
Absolutely, because in fact I got more than others because my piping teacher, I found, complained to others that I kept peppering him with questions about other aspects of culture and how they fit in, and his other pupils didn't. Plus, I was the only one who really had a grasp of Gaelic, and so I keep saying was the Gaelic. And then later on I went to other piping teachers, one of whom really embraced that. That was Alec McRae in Pitagawan, although he was a Gairloch man. And I got a lot of my tales from him, and the background to the pipe tunes, and also even methods of playing them which had been ironed out for the competitions. And so I maintained those. Unfortunately, I've had trouble with my nerves in my hands now, so that's probably out the door, but I'm happy to pass those on to anyone else who wants them.
Do you think they're being lost?
Perhaps, but I do get asked questions frequently. People ask me about what I think of the state of Scottish folk culture and so on. And when they zero in on piping, my response to that is usually quite different from the others. Piping is now done. You get jazz piping and rock piping, and it's played in this and it's played in that. But the traditional way of piping is still kicking. It's still going, and often by the same players. And I think that's very healthy. Loads of people play the pipes now, and it's a greater range available, but it hasn't knocked out the original tradition.
No, that's very interesting. I noticed that a couple of the innovative pipers that I'm aware of, Gordon Duncan and the late Martin Bennett, well, both are late Gordon Duncan and the late Martin Bennett.
I was one of the pallbearers at his funeral. I was one of his teachers.
There we are. So you were Martin Bennett's teacher, or one of his teachers.
Yes, not his first, but I've got his pipe box under my bed in the next room.
Well, he and Gordon were very innovative, but also conversant with the authentic culture.
That's right. But I hear people who do both, not regularly. I did shows on the Fringe last summer, and I would usually play the pipes after particular folk tales to show the association, but because of the state of my fingers I couldn't, so I got a young piper in from Lesmahago who's not from the culture, but he can play them in the traditional way. I've loaned him my old family pipes. They're a deeper pitch than the modern ones, so he can start adapting to those. He was playing modern pipes for that, which are not that different, but he's yes, I find that among the piping fraternity there's loads of scope, and the human capabilities are quite vast. We can encompass both. We can play innovative music, but we can also carry on the traditional.
And finally, the wider tradition, do you think it will survive? The nuances that you're aware of that are not being subsidised, do you think there's any hope for them?
I don't. A number of reasons. One of them is it's been going on for so long that a revival has lost its context. For example, over the years, I've applied for over 50 years to get an artist residency, somewhere in a community where there was enough of the folk culture still going, where I could train people, for example, in traditional dance. I never got an interview, let alone a residency. All the residencies were given to missionaries brought up from England to teach them the English version of everything. Really, a lot of the Scottish arts money was going to bring people up from London to teach us to imitate them. Whatever was fashionable then was what was enforced here with government funding. I never got a grant. I never got a residency. I've never had a full-time job in Scotland. I've never had an interview for a full-time job in Scotland. And that's very typical, and it's quite racist. It's very much so. But I go to these communities now and I befriend young people. I've got quite a few young friends who are interested in this. But even those brought up in Highland villages spend more time on Xbox. They listen to American pop music. They don't walk outside up and down hills. They don't have the physicality to do the old dance style. The last person I managed to get I could teach the men's dance style to was about 20 years ago, over 20 years ago. And he was brought up in a particular glen where he was sent up the hillside to bring sheep down for a neighbour. And he was brought up with the traditional music because his father was a musician. It was surrounded by it. So he knew the music, he knew the culture in general, and he had the right movement, physicality. The ones I meet now don't have that. They don't have any of that. Even one that I've worked with a lot over the past more than 10 years is an award-winning Gaelic singer. But the school trained him from a young age to sing with the vocal tones and pitch that was devised for English church choirs to sing with the organ. So they sing like this. And that's not the Gaelic tradition. And I've been trying to get him to drop that and learn the original vocal tone and pitch, which is the same pitch at which you speak.
The words were always paramount, weren't they?
They were. And you were more likely to change the melody if you had to make an adjustment than the words.
Yeah. Is there anything that we can do, that we should do, to help save what's left of our authentic culture?
Make it an open discussion and admit to it. I go to meetings at the tracks and so on like that, and they're still compartmentalizing everything. The music people have nothing to do with the storytelling people, they have nothing to do with the dance people and so on. They don't, and I put in a proposal several years ago, and it was a last minute attempt. The School of Scottish Studies was advertising for someone to be a traditional artist in residence, dealing with them. And I put forward a proposal that I would do this, and I'm within walking distance, quite happy to get there, to bring the meaning back by showing how the songs relate to the folk tales, relate to the pipe tunes, and all of this. No interview. And it ended up going to a jazz musician who, his art form, traditional art, is to go to the archives and take samples of recordings that he doesn't understand, take them out of that and then put them into a collage, therefore further depriving them of any meaning or substance.
Contextless.
They're completely gone. That's where they've headed. I have no respect for them whatsoever.
That's the School of Scottish Studies.
That's right. They've become dominated by people who've spent their entire life in the education system, and it's little protection, and I see them competing with one another for status. But what are they doing for the culture as a whole? Nothing. But I think it's important to embrace the people who've still got this. My neighbourhood here had the first Gaelic medium school in Edinburgh, and I was one of the people who campaigned to get it set up, and I knew all the other activists who got it set up. Once it was set up, we were all eliminated because we came from Gaelic speaking backgrounds and the traditional culture. Consequently, we didn't have good qualifications. They got in people with qualifications who then learned artificially in short courses in Skye, which we couldn't qualify for because we didn't have the qualifications to get in there. So it was dominated by people who were, in essence, revivalists, who don't come from the culture. And I find what they do is that they'll take an Anglo-American fad and just put in Gaelic words.
Well, James, thank you very much indeed.
Sure.